Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our Native ancestors' stories and history alive, while also sharing with you our Native culture, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And I hope you'll do me a favor. Feel free to like and share these episodes. I so appreciate it. Yakoki.
I wanted to serve my country, but I joined the National Guard at 17 years old, and I went to basic training in between my junior and senior year. About 3 years in, I volunteered to go to Afghanistan, and I learned a lot about the Mongolian culture. I learned a lot about the Afghan culture. That opened my eyes that there's so much difference in the world, and a lot of people, they've never seen, just the privilege that sometimes we may have.
See and share our stories at togetherwe'remore.com.
You're listening to part 5 of this series.
So when we're talking about men and men's roles, one of the things is each of the villages had something called the Tvshka Chapota, which is like the little warriors. And so these were small bands of warriors that kept guard outside of the village. And so they would alert the village if there was an attack that was coming. And so they'd usually be in the tree line around the village, and they had shifts like throughout the day. That was part of the duties that some of the boys and some of the men would have had throughout the day, is being on shift constantly to protect the village.
Wow. And that's an important role.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to the Muscogee, you have a couple of stories for us. Why don't you start with the ambush of the Creek War Party?
Yeah. So a few years ago, we were traveling to Alabama, and Ian Thompson and I happened to stop at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And they had this massive 20-volume unpublished manuscript by Henry S. Halbert. And so we got in, we were looking at it, and it was some of the most amazing things in there. So we got copies, and we've transcribed some of it over the years. We've been working 10 years on it to get these transcriptions done. But our ultimate goal is to publish it. We have permission from ADAH, and so to publish the Halbert manuscript. So it's still a few years down the road, but some of these stories that I'm going to talk about come from this. So these aren't stories that are accessible unless you go to the archives. So that's one of the reasons I really want to share them, because I think they're super cool. So one of these stories, this was recorded in 1880 by Charlie Hohentubby. And so this is a story that happened in Kemper County, Mississippi. There was a Choctaw hunter. His name was Nakoa, one who maddens and kills.
Yeah.
So Nakoa is the word for angry. Nakoa, someone that, makes angry. And then Ubby, which means to kill. So they madden and they kill. So this gentleman was sitting in his home. He was, reclining on the couch during midday, as men do. And he hears a turkey call. And he's like, there's a turkey around. So he gets up, he grabs his gun, he goes outside, and he hears this turkey call. So, he looks over to the direction of where he thinks he hears it, and he's like, oh, okay, it's over there. And what he doesn't know is that there was 4 Creek warriors that showed up to this hamlet. And they were going to basically attack whoever was there and, raid and then, go back home, share their victories, that sort of thing. And so what they wanted to do was they were going to ambush whoever came out. So one of the Creek warriors climbed to the top of the tree and he started making turkey calls. And the other 3 were at the bottom of the tree waiting. And so, this would have worked because he would be like, oh, the turkey's over there. So he would walk towards the turkey. He would sneak up. And these Creek warriors would have seen Nakoa before, he saw them. But what the warriors didn't realize is there was like a swampy area in between the hamlet and the tree. But Nokoichiabi knew about that. So he went around the wet area, the wetland. And when he came up from behind, he was sneaking up in the turkey. He saw the Muscogee warrior in the tree and the other three down at the base of the tree. So he brought up his gun and he shot the one that was in the top of the tree. And when he fell down and hit the ground, it scared the other three off and they took off running. And so he went over and, he collected whatever he could and then, he went back home. But
Oh, that's so cool.
yeah,
I love
it's
this.
it's a
And you
cool
won't
story.
find it in the history books,
No,
folks.
it's a
How
cool story.
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so it's kind of like, once he realized what was going on, that's when, his kind of warrior skills kicked in. But, it's luck, right? It's dumb luck.
Yeah.
He knows the terrain, he knows the
He knew the
environment.
terrain.
He has the home advantage.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Which was extremely important back then, even
Yeah.
more so than now.
Hmm. So there's another story, and this story was recorded by Dixon um, Tuckalumby in 1880. The story takes place on Naniwaya Creek, there in Winston County, Mississippi. So this is really close to the mound.
Yeah.
So there were 5 Choctaws that made camp. And while they were there at camp, 4 of them went off to go hunting. And so the 5th man stayed to cook and get dinner ready. So they were going to go on and hunt and get some meat. And he was going to stay and he was going to go ahead and, cook up some tonche labona. So about an hour after his buddies left, 5 Muscogee warriors arrive and they surround him. And he's like, okay, well, I'm outnumbered 5-1. I don't even have my weapons. He's like, all I have is a ladle. So what he does is the Muscogee warriors demand that that he serves them dinner. So he's still cooking the tonche labona. So he gets some dried venison and he gives that to them and they sit around in a circle and they're eating the venison. And so he takes the pot off the coals and he's waiting for it to cool off and he has his big gourd ladle. So he has a gourd ladle and he has the tonche labona in there. Well, he knows that these Muscogee warriors are going to kill him once he feeds them. So
Exactly.
he's trying to think quick. So what he does is he takes the ladle of like this, boiling hot tonche labona, throws it in their faces. So he's trying to throw it in their eyes, and they're all sitting in a circle around him. He throws it in their faces and he takes off running before they can react. So the story talks about he takes off running like a deer into the woods. So he finds his buddies and he tells his buddies what happened, and they all sneak back to camp and they surround it. But the Muscogee warriors had left. But they had left so quickly, they didn't touch the tonche labona.
Oh,
So they just they came back and I guess they ate
they
it.
got to
So,
eat it
yeah,
anyway.
yeah, yeah. And
When the
so
Tachilabona is actually your best weapon.
yes, yes, a ladle of tonche labona thrown
So
straight into the face of
smart.
your enemy. So they called
Make
him
him a warrior, man.
well, yeah, and that's why I wonder if he was maybe a young man because they called him Naknifina, which means like very brave. It's talking about he's
Yeah.
very manly, he's very Nakni.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That is so cool. I love it.
Hmm. It's a fun story. So this story takes place in about 1808. It's 5 years before the War of 1812, and it also takes place in Winston County, Mississippi, which is where the mound is. So there was a family that went out. There were 6 men, 5 women, and several children, and they went out to go bear hunting. And so they set up camp. And so, Choctaw people have a story about the biscuitic and, the yellow-belly sapsucker. And if a biscuitic appears and starts to chirp, then that tells them that there's danger nearby. So they've set up camp, and this biscuitic shows up. So they quickly pack up their camp. They move to the west side of the river, and then they move a few miles south and they set up camp. A couple days later, they get their camp, they've moved and they got camp set up, and a Bisknik appears again. And so, listening to the bird, they decide to move several miles south this time. So, they set up camp, and the six men go out to hunt, to go bear hunting. While the men are gone, the Bisknik appears again. And so, as the hours go on, the Bisknik's getting more and more agitated, getting more upset, and the women are really, really worried. At that point, a Muscogee war party comes out of the woods, and they grab the women and the children, and they loot the camp. And they take them on rafts across the river. And they come to find out there's about 200 warriors under a chief named Choctaw. So he's a Muscogee war chief named Choctaw. So they're on a quick march, and so they're trying to get back. They've performed their raid. That was their intent, but they want to get back to Muscogee lands so that they're safe again. Well, along the way, the women and the children keep holding them up. So the Muscogee end up killing the children and leaving them on the side of the path.
Aw.
And they take their women, and they take the women that they had stolen, and they move on. When the men come back, they see that the camp had been plundered, and they also had set fire to the camp. So the men run back to their town, and they inform the war chief there of what happened. So that war chief quickly raises 250 warriors.
Yeah.
And the war party gets ready and starts following the tracks. Along the journey, they find the children on the side of the trail. So they have they go through a ceremony, and they bury the children. But it's kind of, the men are really upset now, and they keep moving. Meanwhile, so Chief Choctaw had stopped and made camp along the Tuscaloosa River near Tuscaloosa, Alabama today. So he's like, we're back, we're close to Creek homelands, we're safe, we're good, we can take a break. So the Choctaw War Party is led by a chief named Oktama. So Oktama, he's got 260 warriors, and when they get to the camp, he sends out his scouts, and they find the camp. And so they sit back and they wait. And the Muscogee chief Choctaw, all his men are up all night dancing and celebrating. And so when it gets, really early in the morning, they all crash out and they go to sleep. So that's when the Choctaw War Party surrounds them. One of the Choctaw warriors, while they're all asleep, he crawls into the camp, and he has his gun, and he shoots into an area where there's a bunch of Muscogee warriors that are asleep. Well, the fires have died down, so it's a little bit darker. So when the gun is fired, all the Muscogee warriors wake up. And when they do, they think they're being attacked. So they start grabbing their weapons, but they end up start fighting each other. So all the different Muscogee warriors are fighting each other. They're killing each other with knives, tomahawks, guns, bows, everything. And so, they start cutting into each other. And at that point, the Choctaw warriors who surrounded the camp then also run in, and they finish off the remaining warriors. So they ended up freeing the 5 women, and they had taken some captives back with them to their village. And so this story was told by 3 Choctaw men who had participated in the battle. And they were Hoshtolo, Chintubi, and Tishakubby. And they were all from Neshoba County, Mississippi.
Warriors. You're not going to take our women and our children.
Mm-hmm.
That's
But
amazing.
Yeah. And so earlier we were talking about how, preserving life, right? So you have 200 warriors, and, they only take 5 women and a group of children. But for them, that was a successful raid. They had done what they needed to do. There wasn't any reason to press their luck and have any loss of life. And so that they were content with that raid being successful and then moving on. And so just like the Creeks did in that moment, Choctaws did that too. It didn't matter how small a victory was a victory, and then they would come back from that.
Yeah, so their goal wasn't to then go find the rest of the Muscogee and slaughter them all.
Mm-mm. It's just, their goal was to pay that blood debt. So this story is a little bit different. This one is a published story. It's in a book. Um, it's by Galay. But this one is also a story about a war party. So this one's much earlier. This story's in 1706. So as we were talking about earlier, you have these um, Muscogee people that are being sponsored by the English to do slave raiding into Choctaw country. So what ends up happening is along the eastern border, Choctaw speaking people used to be as far as Montgomery, Alabama. But because of settlement pressure and because of these raids, Choctaw people keep retreating back towards the west. And so basically the Tombigbee River was that boundary between Choctaw and Muscogee people. And so in 1706, there was an Englishman named John Stewart, and he was participating in these raids that the Muscogee were doing against the Choctaw. And so this particular story talks about how there was 12 Muscogee warriors. They were all mounted, and an Englishman, and they all had guns, and they were traveling along a trail. And they saw a lone Choctaw man who was walking along this trail. And he had no horse, he's just walking along, and he has no gun. He only has his bow and his arrow. So they decide to ride down and attack this man. So the Choctaw man sees them coming, and he starts running through the pine forest. And throughout this whole journey, he's running over 4 miles, and he's being chased by these men on horseback. Throughout that 4 miles, he's constantly outmaneuvering all 12 of these warriors and the Englishmen. And he would stop, he would turn, and he would shoot his bow. And when he'd shoot his bow, he would wound. So he ended up wounding or killing every single horse that was in the party. So he either wounded or killed at least 12 to 13 horses. He wounded most of the Muscogee warriors. And the Englishman that was on his horse, he had shot an arrow that went through the Englishman's leg and pinned his leg to the horse. So then, after he ran out of arrows, he ran over and he swam across a river. And from the opposite bank, then he started taunting the war party. And so by that time, the war party, they're all bloodied. Their horses are dead. They all have arrow wounds. And so they just turn around and go on because they decided,
And this is just one man.
this is one man. Yeah.
One man. Man,
Mhm.
he gets double warrior status. These
Yeah.
stories are fantastic.
Well, and they show the skill. I mean, these are
Yeah.
things that Choctaw men they worked their entire lives to become expert hunters, to become expert warriors. These accounts that I've been reading over the past few weeks, you know, um, one of them is something I've always said, but one of them compares them to Spartans because they start at such a young age and they're so elite, by the time that they're adults.
And again, my perspective coming into this conversation, because I didn't know all these stories that you were going to tell, my perspective has definitely changed because, again, I always had the feeling of we were always farmers. Well, surely we were warriors at one point. There would have been no way to survive otherwise.
Mhm.
Man, our people are amazing.
Well, and we've been warriors longer than farmers. I mean, we have
Much
been
longer.
farmers, but we didn't adopt agriculture until about 2000 years ago.
Yeah.
And so, before then, um, we were a lot more mobile when, we're moving around because we're hunting and we're gathering and we're subsisting. Shellfish and, that kind of stuff was a lot bigger.
Right.
But, it's just, as a warrior society, we're a defensive warrior society. And it worked well for us. It's all about knowledge that's being passed down from generation to generation to generation. It's all about those unique things that are passed from, from each clan and from each moiety. And so a lot of that knowledge has gone to sleep. Um, and it's sad, but at the same time, it's okay because, if we need that knowledge again as we interact with the land and, we interact and we have the mindset that our ancestors did, these things will come back.
Yes.
It'll take a while, but they'll come back. Yeah.
The War of 1812, you have a story about that as well, right?
Yeah. So this is a cool story. This story was recorded by Horatio Cushman in his book, The History of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Natchez Indians. So Cushman was from Mississippi, and he grew up in Choctaw homelands, and he grew up around Choctaw people. And he moved to Texas later in life. And while he was in Texas, he decided to come up to Indian Territory and in the early 1900s interview all these different Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Natchez people. And so this is one of the stories that he had recorded, is that this Choctaw scout. So in his story, it's during the Revolution, but in talking with different historians like Greg O'Brien, some of the accounts don't really add up. So we think that it may have happened actually during the War of 1812 instead of the Revolution. But it's a story about a Choctaw warrior. His name is Johnny. They called him Dutch Johnny. And so at that time period, that was a derogatory name that was used. The Black Dutch was a derogatory term for someone that was mixed native and white. And so in the South, it was very heavily used. But anyway, so Johnny was a scout for the Americans. And he was out on patrol. And so it was getting late one night, and there was this abandoned cabin. So he's like, well, I'll go ahead and, I'll set up in this cabin tonight. So he goes in the cabin and he takes all his gear off and he sets it down and he goes to sleep. Well, he wakes up a little while later because he hears noises and movement and all sorts of stuff. And so he grabs all of his stuff and he runs up into the rafters. Now, if you've been in a cabin, the rafters are basically, it's a cabin, and then the rafters are just the beams in the top, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's dark, so they can't see him up there, but he's in the rafters and he has his stuff. And so he's hiding up there. Well, he realizes all these people come in. And so I can't remember if he said if they were Tories but I think they were a group of American Tories and Cherokees, I think.
Okay.
And so, there's a handful, like 15, 20, something like that, of this war party that's there. And so he realizes that, he can't stay up there all night because in the morning they're going to wake up and they're going to see him. Once it's daylight, they'll see him. And so he's thinking and he's like, okay, he's trying to climb across the beams to where he can get a good point, grab his stuff and kind of swing down and drop down. And then maybe he can run out of there. He's not quite sure, but so he's going across the beams and he reaches out and he can't find the other beam, but he knows it's out there. So in his mind, he's like, okay, I know the beam's out there. So he just leaps for it and he leaps for it and he misses.
Oh, God.
So he comes crashing down in the middle of the floor at this cabin while all these people are asleep. And mind you, they have their muskets all set up, right, in those little tripods. Right. And so it's either on his way down or while he's scrambling to get up, he fires off one of the muskets.
Oh, my God.
And they all get scared and they think that they're under attack. So they get up and they take off running out of the cabin. And as they're running, he's still standing there. So he's grabbing the muskets and he's firing them one by one after them while they're all running away. So they think they're being attacked by this group and they don't know the size of it.
So like, don't mind if I do. I'll just go ahead.
Yeah. So he grabs all of his stuff and he takes off running and he goes back to the American camp. And he goes in and he tells the camp what happened. And they don't believe him. They're like, no, this didn't happen. We don't believe you, whatever. So the next morning, him and some of the Americans come out and they see the scene. They see all the British muskets there and they see they all been fired and like some of his stuff is still there. Like, and so, yeah, they finally believed him. But it's like, it's
That's
a mixture
great.
of dumb luck and skill.
I
That's,
know, right? Don't you know? Can you imagine what he was thinking as he was falling? He's like, I'm dead. I'm dead.
yeah,
I'm falling into the
yeah,
snake pit.
hmm yeah. And
This
yeah,
is
that's
so awesome.
it's one of my favorite stories. I think it's hilarious. Like
Oh man, poor
it's
guy.
all about quick thinking, right?
Right? I
Hmm
know. And he's like, you guys won't believe this. And they're like, yeah, we don't believe you. There's no way that happened. Yes, it
Yeah,
did. I
yeah,
promise.
yeah. hmm
Man. And it just shows too how it was the Wild West back then. And it was wilder than we probably even know. There were probably so many stories like that.
Yeah, I bet there were lots.
Well, for our last story that's battle related, on January 8th, 1815 was the Battle of New Orleans, and the Choctaws were involved in that battle. How so?
So, Choctaws were fighting in a lot of alongside Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812, and they were fighting the Muscogee. And, you know, Jackson was in New Orleans at this time, and, the British were preparing to attack New Orleans. So, a Choctaw warrior named Pierre Houzan gathered a group of like 55 to 65 warriors, and they sailed from Pensacola to New Orleans. And they got there. And so when the British, there was a period of like a battle and some little skirmishes before the major battle of New Orleans. But during that time, in European fashion, what would happen is you had two armies and they would kind of march towards each other. And once they got too close, they'd have a little skirmish, they'd back up, and then you had pickets that were set up.
Mhm.
And so if you ran into a picket, you'd shoot, you play with the picket, whatever, you'd back off, then you get your formal war together.
Yeah.
Pickets weren't supposed to be, a part of combat. It was just if you're out walking around and you see the picket, oh, there's the enemy, I need to get away from here type of thing.
Mm.
Well, Choctaws didn't really look at pickets like that. So on one side of camp, every single picket was killed by Choctaws for like a period of 2 weeks. If you had picket duty, there was a high chance you were going to die. I think they
Oh,
killed
wow.
5 or 6 pickets. They would sneak up. So this is a man standing on duty, looking at his surroundings in the middle of the night. And these Choctaw warriors would sneak up and kill them. And so I think there was 5 or 6 pickets that were killed throughout this time. And they talk about how when they would go out to visit the Choctaw warriors, the warriors would be laying out on the logs like alligators, just like chilling
Ooh.
during the day. That's what,
Right.
yeah. So at one point, after the pickets were killed, one time Choctaws snuck in and they went into the British tents and they would kill one person in every tent. And so I don't know how many tents, there were, how many people they killed, but when those people woke up in the morning, in a
Oh my
series of
goodness.
several tents, they woke up and there was one person dead in every tent.
That's creepy.
So as a period of several weeks, the British were so afraid of the Choctaw warriors. And so during the Battle of New Orleans itself, you had the British right flank that was coming in through the swamps. And they're attacking, I think it was either the Kentucky or the Tennessee militia were on that front. And so as the British are marching in their line and the militia are marching in their line and they're in this swamp, Choctaws are on the flanks and coming from the rear. And there's only 55 warriors. There was like 300 British. There's only 50 Choctaws, and they caused more than half of the casualties to that British unit.
Wow.
And they
Wow.
and they routed the British right flank. So as the British are breaking through the American right flank, the Choctaws have broken the British right flank, which caused the militia groups to swing in. And
Okay.
so, and which helped kind of restore balance. So if it wasn't for the Choctaws and all of their mental warfare as well as their guerrilla warfare, then we may have lost the Battle of New Orleans.
Unbelievable.
And so you have like, I forget if it's 3,000 or 4,000 troops that are there fighting for Jackson. It's those 65 Choctaw warriors are what made a huge difference to that battle.
Well, and that makes you also think broader picture. Tecumseh was one of those people that tried to go around to the different tribes and say, look, if we all get together, we can defeat
Mhm.
these forces from outsiders that are coming in trying to take over our land. And you always wonder what would have happened if they had truly come together and had done that. And ultimately, his plan fell apart. But thinking about that,
Mhm.
the Choctaw alone, as one tribe, as 65 people in this case, I think you said they did massive amounts of damage. And can
Mhm.
you imagine if all the tribes came together and acted as one? This may be a totally different area if
One
they
of,
had
one of
succeeded.
one of my buddies is Shawnee, and that's, he's always like, "Come on, man!" Like because Tecumseh came down and would give a speech, and then after he'd leave, Pushmataha would come and give another speech of "Let's not get involved in this conflict." And then, throughout that whole time, we tried to stay neutral in the conflict until we had to choose sides. So we chose the Americans. And so my buddy's like, "Well, how did that work out for you?" And I'm like, "Not very
Thanks a lot,
well."
Choctaw.
Yeah, yeah, because he's from the same, he's descendant from the same village that Tecumseh comes from.
Amazing.
What's interesting too is Tecumseh's mother was Muscogee.
Really?
That's some of
Oh,
the
I didn't
reason
know
he
that.
had, and the Shawnee were closely allied with the Muscogee too. And we had fought the Shawnee for a little bit as well when
Yeah.
they came down into the southeast.
At the same time, I can totally see why any leader of a tribe would go, we have to make a decision. Do we fight to the death? Do we just give in order to save what few people we have left? I've always said I can't imagine being on that side of that decision.
What's hard, we tried to stay neutral throughout the American Civil War too, and that, of course, that didn't pan out.
Yeah. How sad.
Hmm.
And what a weight, a burden on the shoulders of those leaders.
Stay tuned for part 6 of this series.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.